Welcome to the 2024 Norman Krumholz Speaker on the Future of Urban Planning. Welcome, welcome, welcome. If you're interested in socially responsible planning and development, you are in the right place. It's good to see you all. Some familiar faces, some new faces, students, practitioners, scholars. Welcome, everybody. Even though the speaker series is titled The Future of Urban Planning, this year we are reflecting upon the past to help inform our future of urban planning. This year we honor the legacy of Norman Krumholz and his City of Cleveland staff in the audience today and beyond for authoring the 1974 Cleveland Policy Plan, the first municipal social equity plan. This policy plan is unique for city planning because it wasn't focused on the arrangement of land uses like we traditionally think about in urban planning. It was focused on the quality of life issues for the people of Cleveland, particularly providing more choices to those who have few. You'll hear more about this during the program today. The speaker series is intended for anyone interested in urban planning and equity planning, scholars, practitioners, community members, and students. I'd like to thank this year's advisory committee for helping put together a wonderful program. If you are on the advisory committee, please raise your hand so we can see around. Good to see you all, and thank you for your time and efforts in this program. If you're interested in being on next year's committee, please find me or anybody on the committee. We'd love to have you be a part of it. I would also like to thank Dennis Keating, co-chair of the advisory committee, for his guidance and his thoughtfulness in putting together the program. Thank you, Dennis. This event is also an opportunity to support our students. In lieu of a registration fee, we ask for you to consider donating to the Norman and Virginia Krumholz Student Scholarship. You'll find QR codes on a digital program on the tables. A QR code will take you to different elements of the program, both an online version of the program so you can follow along, donation to the Krumholz Scholarship, and also more information about our participants for today. Know that 100% of the donation goes to the scholarship. There is no overhead taken by the university or any other institutional body. It all goes to the scholarship because that's important to us. If you've benefited from the scholarship, please raise your hand. See some people around here. Very good. We'll also hear from a scholarship recipient from this year later on today. You'll also see the CSU student chapter of the American Planning Association in the house. Please stop by and say hello to them. And if you see students, raise your hand today. Go and say hi to them. They might be a little bit nervous talking to you, so maybe you can talk to them. Lastly, you can follow along with all the things that we're doing today as in the program and the QR codes. I think really what I want to say is for those of you that are coming back to Levin to see this event, welcome back. If you're here for the first time, don't make it the last time. Come back and see us and be a part of the family. And at this time, I hope that you enjoy today's program. You're going to see me kind of here and there throughout the program, but there are lots of different people that have things to say and will share throughout today's events. And also know that when the program itself ends at around 5:15, that there's a social afterwards to just hang out and enjoy each other's company. Please stay and hang out. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephanie Ryberg-Webster, professor and co-chair of the School of Urban Planning.
Thank you, Beth. Just take a little minute and give Beth and the organizing committee another round of applause for all of their work. So I want to take a few minutes. I want to reiterate Dr. Nagy's welcome to the Norman Krumholz Speaker Series on the Future of Urban Planning. As she said, I'm Stephanie Ryberg-Webster. I'm a professor here at the Levin College of Public Affairs and Education. I'm also currently serving as the Levin School's Interim Associate Director, the program lead for our longstanding Master of Urban Planning and Development program, and the program lead for our brand new, as you can see over there on our banner sign, BA in Community Planning, which is a really exciting development. You may see on the program Dean Jill Gordon's name, and I want to just take a minute to convey that she sends her regrets for not being able to be here today. She was called away on a personal matter, And she wanted us to just thank you all for being here today and to thank Beth and the organizing committee for their work on this afternoon's events. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about Norm before I introduce our next speaker. The Venerable Norm Krumholz led the Cleveland City Planning Commission from 1969 until 1979. During his tenure as planning director, Norm led the landmark Cleveland Policy Planning Report, which was written in 1974, 50 years ago. Norm's appointment coincided with rising backlash against the physical renewal efforts of prior decades. Norm's goal was to give, quote, more choices to those who have few. He shifted focus away from downtown and physical planning to the city's neighborhoods and lower income residents who were struggling. Norm and his staff pushed for things like regional low-income housing. They promoted mobility and lower fares for transit-dependent residents. They worked to keep neighborhoods intact and to block further disruptions. He sought redistributive policies. He always questioned who pays and who benefits. The Cleveland Policy Planning Report addressed the social problems of disadvantaged residents rather than outlining physical development strategies, as Beth mentioned. Norm's vision and leadership left a sustained impact on planning, not only here in Cleveland, but around the world. After leaving the Planning Commission in 1979, Norm joined the Levin College, where he served for more than 3 decades. And I was fortunate to call him a colleague for my first few years here at CSU. In preparing for today, I recalled an interview I actually did with Norm more than 15 years ago. This is before I came to CSU. I was here in Cleveland doing dissertation research at the time, and I was also working as a teaching assistant for a planning history class at the University of Pennsylvania. I met with Norm to talk about community development in neighborhoods and particular issues on the city's east side. But at the end of that kind of research-focused talk, I paused and I shifted gears to ask him to reflect on his career a bit and to offer advice that I recorded. I'm gonna do something with this audio one of these days. And the idea was that I was gonna take it back to this planning history class, graduate students, and play it for them so they could hear his voice. So I wanted to share a little bit of what he said in that part of our conversation all those years ago. In reflecting on his own work, I asked him if he started again, what would he do differently? And he said he'd pretty much do it the same. He said he'd still figure out how to get more choices for people who had few. He would try to figure out how to raise incomes for the poor and how to do things that were not the traditional things that planners did at the time, but that he thought were the things that planners should be doing. He was proud to, quote, provide an idea of what planners could do if they were bold, and to provide an inspiration to young planners still today, end quote. His direct advice for planners was to embrace their potential to instigate change, to do more and to try harder, and to use their skills and resources, particularly things like comprehensive thinking and access to information, to use those things wisely with intent and purpose. As for professors, he said that we should encourage aspiring planners to take more risks and to be more bold. In summary, he said, quote, I guess in the end, I call for more boldness, end quote. I see Norm's values and his call for bold ideas permeate the work of our alumni, many of whom are here in this room and who are out doing great things in the world and impacting our city and our region today. I hope that we here at Levin continue to live up to Norm's ideals in our work to train and uplift new generations of planners who are called through a public service motivation to make our city, our communities, and our world a better place for all human beings. So again, I want to thank Dr. Beth Nagy and her team for organizing this event, Dr. June Manning-Thomas for joining us. I hope that the conversation today continues to inspire us to heed Norm's advice and to be bold in our efforts to shape a better urban future for all. And now I have the great honor of introducing my colleague, Dr. Dennis Keating. Dennis is a professor emeritus and a distinguished scholar here at the Levin College, where he served for 35 years. This past spring, the Urban Affairs Association awarded Dr. Keating the Contribution to the Field of Urban Affairs Award, the organization's highest honor. I'm going to borrow from that award committee's assessment, which captures Dennis's contribution or attempts to capture Dennis's contribution. I'm not sure it's possible to fully capture it to our field. Dr. Keating's prolific writing on community development and housing policy has been influential to both scholars and practitioners, particularly those seeking to address the inequities of race and class segregation. He is an exemplar of a locally rooted researcher, contributing significantly to community development organizations, equity in urban planning, and advancing fair housing in Cleveland. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dennis Keating.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming today. As Beth indicated, we're here to go back to the future and look at something that happened 50 years ago and its impact. Going to hear a lot about that today, and keep Norm's spirit alive. I am largely here and was here at the college largely because of Norm Krumholz moving from the San Francisco Bay Area in terms of Norm's reputation for progressive social policy thinking. And it was all true, and I had a long and fruitful relationship with Norm, including a lot of writing together. So we're 50 years from 1974, different time, but a lot of the same issues exist. There are copies available and also online of the Cleveland Policy Plan. Cleveland Policy Plan got a fair amount of attention at the time. It later became, and Norm was at one point president of the American Planning Association, a planning landmark, which is not something that is more than occasionally named by the American Planning Association, and certainly deserved by Norm. Another major accomplishment of Norm within the profession was his tireless agitating and eventual success in changing the code of ethics of the American Planning Association so that urban planners, including our students here, were made aware as professional planners of their duty to consider social policy and the social needs of everyone in society, not narrowing their viewpoint. In terms of the plan, by way of introduction, for those of you who are not familiar with it, we're going to have a speaker later who was there with Norm and others in 1974, so she will, much better than I, recount how it all happened. I'm going to steal from an article by Bob Brown, who is with us today, former planning director for the city of Cleveland, and he wrote a retrospective about Norm entitled "Rebel with a Plan: Norm Krumholz and Equity Planning in Cleveland." Equity planning was the phrase that Norm went by. And this is a brief introduction to that plan. The work of Krumholz's city planning staff culminated, but did not end, in 1975, and was actually published with its publication, a bold and groundbreaking comprehensive plan that made social policy the centerpiece of Cleveland's city planning program. Cleveland's plan quickly took center stage nationally and even internationally in the field of city planning, as it sparked debate over the appropriate role of the city planner in government. And one of Norm's goals was to introduce progressive ideas within city government, within planning departments, and influencing others who had perhaps greater power within city governments, but also to influence their thinking. Krumholz would argue that a planner is what a planner does. In other words, a city planner needs not to be constrained by the traditionally defined parameters of the profession. This meant that planners in Cleveland could use their skills and talents to tackle issues of poverty and income redistribution, while planners in other cities continue to add more conventional planning issues such as land use and urban design. Not that they'd be discounted, but that was not Norm's emphasis. Then, if you should read the plan, compared to other comprehensive plans done by planners in cities across the country, it had some unusual quotation references. That plan quoted no less than Daniel Webster, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, our greatest mayor in Cleveland, Tom Johnson, Plato, and Jesus of Nazareth. These are not references you usually find in planning documents coming out of City Hall, but that group published something beyond the norm. They also focused on issues of housing, transportation, and other pressing issues that are still with us today in 2024. So as Stephanie mentioned, the byword that came out of the Cleveland Policy Plan was, in the context of limited resources and pervasive inequalities, priority attention must be given to the task of promoting a wide range of choices for those who have few, if any, choices. And here we are today in a city that I believe still has the second highest poverty rate in the United States. We are, I believe, still, unfortunately, sadly, number one in maternity deaths. We have great problems in our housing stock, including lead poisoning, which is being addressed finally a bit, and other social problems. So with Norman with us today, I'm sure he would be up here telling us that we must solve these, or at least address these problems, and not stop for a moment. So in terms of the policy plan, it, I think, has influenced planning, and particularly planning students. Norm was much beloved by his students. I think some of his former students are perhaps here today. By way of example, and in particular, he emphasized as a former professional planner in Pittsburgh, brought here to Cleveland by Mayor Carl Stokes, that you got to get out from behind that desk and get out there in the field. He worked with many community groups. He helped in the formation of the Cleveland Housing Network, a national model for affordable housing. He was on the board of several community organizations. So in terms of the model of a not conventional planner, and as he'd like to say, working under three very different mayors, not just Carl Stokes, but Ralph Perk and then Dennis Kucinich, he really set a very unusual, but he hoped engaging example that could be replicated by planners elsewhere. So that's why we're here today, 50 years later, to remember that document, but more the spirit of Norm and his goals for progressive planning and planners. And I think with that, we are going to move on to our keynote speaker. So, June, if you could come on up. So we are very fortunate today to have with us June Manning Thomas. She's a, I don't want to use the word retired, I don't like that word, but she's no longer teaching at, yes. Her resume, we could spend the rest of her slot on the program just reading her resume, goes on for great length. Her last former title was the Mary Frances Berry Distinguished University Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. She was once here briefly back in the early 80s at this very college. Alas, she left us, as Woody Hayes would have said, for that university up north. But she's back with us today. She is a past president of the American Collegiate Schools of Planning. She's a co-founder and co-chair of the Planners of Color Interest Group at the American Collegiate Schools of Planning. She has published widely, very widely. I'm familiar with some of her work, a lot of which is based on what has happened in our sister city in Michigan, Detroit, both its ups and its downs, including a Detroit Race and Uneven Development, the City After Abandonment, Mapping Detroit, Urban Planning, and the African American Community in the Shadows with Marcia Ritzdorf. So we have with us someone who's dedicated her professional life to dealing with a lot of the issues that Norm and his staff addressed back in 1974. And she is still very active, and I think we will benefit from her reflections. June Thomas.
Oh, thank you. It really is wonderful to be back here. I was here with my husband. We were teaching in, I think it was 81, 82. If that sounds like a long time ago, it was. But somebody in the audience came up to me and said, I remember you. You taught me while you were here. So there's proof. I really was here. I wasn't sure. I just wanted to cover a couple of things, and then I think we have some time for question and answers. I wanted to talk a little bit about just the context of the work of the Cleveland planners as well as Norm Krumholz, my connection with that, and then if we have a few minutes, then we'll talk a little bit about just the future and where we're going. So, of course, as we've already heard, there's just a lot of respect and admiration that people around the world hold for the work of the Cleveland planners, as well as, of course, Norman Krumholz. I was looking up some of the quotes, and I think they've been covered somewhat in terms of what's already been said, but then I just said, well, I'll just see what Google says. You know, that's the authority, and so I put in quotes equity planning, and I got 5.5 million links, if that's any indication. Then I looked up what is the scholarly literature saying in terms of the work that was done by the Cleveland planners. There is this feature in Google Scholar where you can actually find out how many people have used a certain source in terms of their footnotes, and it's one of the ways that scholars, of course, find out the spread and the reach of publications. And so I put in the 1975 article from the Journal of the American Planning Association, and so 123 scholars have cited that in their various articles over the years. Then you'll remember a few years later, in the early 80s, I think it was 82, a retrospective view was published by Norman, and so that received 491 citations that have been used over the years. And then, of course, the book that he wrote with John Forrester received 766 citations. So that gives you just, that's more impressive than the 5.5 million with Google. Because with the Google Scholar, you can see that it's permeated not just the term equity planning, but the concepts have spread throughout academia. And as has been mentioned, this was fairly a revolutionary concept when the Cleveland planners developed their own report, because the context was one that was very different. We mentioned, for example, that they talked about urban problems and what was needed in terms of addressing problems of poverty and race. But we'd had other urban programs that had addressed those problems before. I mentioned some of them in the article that some of you've read. Public housing tried, and by means of, at first, trying to develop community life within the context of publicly owned housing units. Urban renewal tried, but that was in the context of clearing out what was already there. Model cities tried as well in the 1960s, and that was an effort to give urban renewal money to local agencies, which then determined how to spend that money. And then, of course, there were people like Paul Davidoff and the Planners for Equal Opportunity, mentioned in that reference article, who tried in the 1960s their best in 1970s to change the code of ethics, to create a little bit more social consciousness within the urban planning profession. So I should just tell you that all of this happened just before, of course, the Cleveland, as you've heard, Norman took over the Cleveland Planning Department in 1969 and stayed there until 1979. Most of the programs I've referenced were in their heyday in the 1960s and before, but he was really coming on the tail end of that, and we really had not found a lasting concept or theory that could help us move forward from those programs as a profession. And it was about that time that I discovered urban planning. I was taking an urban sociology course at Michigan State University, And I don't know what possessed me to think about urban planning. I grew up in a small town in South Carolina, Orangeburg. My husband says you can drive through it in the space of a stoplight. That's not true. There's not one stoplight at the beginning of the town and another at the end. He says that, but I have to keep telling people that's not true. But it was a very small town. But I somehow grew to love cities because that's where we went to get away from Jim Crow, to get away from racial segregation. We would go to Miami or we would go to Atlanta. So I fled the South. I think it was 1968 that I fled. I finally got out of the South by convincing my parents to let me go north. I ended up at Michigan State University, encountered urban planning through an urban sociology class, read about Jane Jacobs and found out about urban renewal. And I know this is going to sound fantastic, but it is true. I decided to go get a PhD in urban planning because the profession needed saving. Don't chide me on that. This was a genuine feeling that when I read that book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and I understood what urban planning had facilitated in terms of urban renewal, particularly in Lansing, Michigan. I didn't know that much about Detroit at that time. I thought perhaps that this would be a field where I could make a difference because it sure needed help. That's what I was thinking. So I entered a PhD program in urban and regional planning in 1971 with great misgivings. And the misgivings were two in particular. One was that I wasn't quite sure about this profession that had facilitated urban renewal, which Jane Jacobs had talked about. And the other was I didn't really see role models. I certainly didn't see Black role models. But I didn't see any role models, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be in the profession. But they gave me a fellowship, but so they helped pay for it. I ended up in a PhD program, during which time very seldom was race mentioned, very seldom was citizen participation mentioned, but advanced statistics and regression analysis were mentioned a lot. We had to conquer those. Even engineering. So I was taking operations research engineering. It was a very technocratic program. In case there are any University of Michigan alumni in the audience, that's where I got my PhD. I loved the school. It was very nice. It was just the training that was faulty. So looking for role models, one of the people that gradually came into my peripheral vision was Paul Davidoff. Paul Davidoff is, of course, I would say that his advocacy planning is a forerunner of the equity planning. And actually, Paul Davidoff considered equity planning to be a spinoff of advocacy planning. And Paul was very dedicated to social justice, just like Norm. But Paul was more visible at first. So he was the person that, when I was coming out of my PhD program, seemed to be the person that maybe could turn into a role model, wrong color, but what can you do? So maybe he would turn into a role model. But Paul focused on suburban action. He focused on what needed to happen in terms of integration within suburban areas. And I don't know if you know this. You may have heard the term. How many of you have heard the name Paul Davidoff before? Yeah, so the name is maybe familiar to half of you. But I remember distinctly his last address to the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, when it turns out he was arguing for social justice and social equity. But we didn't know he had cancer. And I had taken my husband to that conference, and I was bragging to my husband, who was a Black historian, African American history, and I just had no clout in the household. because I was in urban planning. So I remember I was sitting at the table. We had round tables in this banquet hall, and I turned to my husband after Paul Davidoff spoke, and I said, "See what we got. You know, we've got Paul Davidoff." And he said, "Yeah, you guys are really cool." You know, so I got a little bit of propers from that. But Paul died right after that. So he passed away in 83 or 84. Now, we say the Cleveland Policy Planning Report has had influence since 1974, but I was there. I was in a PhD program at that time, and it didn't. It was not well known. So they worked from 70 to 74, but it wasn't until that first article came out in 1975 that you began to get a glimmering of the possibilities. That was co-authored with Janice and with Norm Krumholz and several other staff. And you began to get a glimmer that maybe there's some movement forward into a different way of looking at planning. And so I think it was the 82 article, the retrospective view, that really began to affect those of us who were looking for some concept, some theory that we could go by. As it happened, the Michigan State University, where my husband and I were teaching at the time, they eliminated their College of Urban Affairs, so it was downsized. And in a huff, we came to Cleveland State University, in a huff. I mean, I packed up my dog, my plants, my house, intending to stay. I won't get into why, but intending to stay. And who should I join on faculty except Norman? Norman and Dennis. So someone said that they were here at the end of his career. I was there pretty close to the beginning because he had left that job in '79. And I shudder to think what would have happened to me and my career and my thinking about the world if I had not met Norm, if I had not come here, because there was so little theoretical rigor and attention to this issue of race and social justice and social equity that there was no place to go. But here was a haven. Here was a place where colleagues talked about racial justice, they talked about social equity, they talked about fairness. They didn't just speak about regression analysis and about my engineering class. By the way, I never used that material. They didn't talk about those things and land use maps. I mean, they knew what they were, they understood the lingo, they understood the tools. But this place was different in part because, of course, of the Cleveland Policy Planning Report. So I just think, there's a lot I could have said today. I actually had a lot of stuff written down, but I think the most important thing is just to tell you, is just to honor that memory with you and let you know that this spread of effects was really quite extraordinary, quite deep. And I can testify to that personally. So I should then just tell you this idea, what should we do going into the future? Well, I was thinking about that since that's the name of the session we're having today. And so this book that Norman put together at the very near the end of his life, Advancing Equity Planning Now. There's a pitch there. It's up there on the bookshelf. It's now available to download free. I think as of 2022 is quite wonderful. So I was looking through that. One more thing I forgot to tell you. The Cleveland Policy Planning Report, the one that's copied, there were some copies, they're probably all gone. Those of us who were being affected by this planning report never actually saw the report. It was not widely spread. We didn't do like PDFs, then. And so it may have been 12 or 13 years ago that I first saw a copy of it. And I actually didn't see a copy, I saw a PDF of it. So it wasn't really, it was the report, but it was like a reflection of the report that was having this great influence on those of us interested in social justice and racial equity. It was the reflection in the articles that Norman and his colleagues wrote, in the books, in the graduates of these programs, and the students that Dennis and Norm tutored, that's where you saw actually the effects. But I was looking at this there's one chapter in this particular book, and it's actually by Ken Reardon and John Forrester, The Future of Equity Planning Education in the United States. It's toward the end of the book, and it's, I think, such a wonderful clarion call that I'd just like to just talk about that for just a couple of minutes. In terms of what does this all mean now? I think someone mentioned, Norm says, yes, we should be bold, we should be braver. And of course, he gave us some of the tools in order to do that. I think some of his writing helped us develop those tools, but I think we have to think about some other ways too, and I think Reardon and Forrester do that very well. And by the way, if you don't know those people, Ken Reardon is an extraordinary scholar who focused for most of his career on East St. Louis, social justice and equity issues in East St. Louis, and John Forrester is probably our most brilliant planning theorist in terms of planning theory. So here's what they said. Cleveland's work showed that we need a far more sophisticated attitude toward applied research in equity planning contexts. So that was one of their first points, that we have to stop seeing ourselves as experts, as providing technical expertise or technical advice, that we have to see that there's much more subtle information that's needed by equity planners. And that subtle information comes from the fact that, as they point out, equity planning is actually a partnership. It has to be a partnership between the community and the planners and the decision makers. So second of all, if we're talking about equity planning in terms of a partnership and what that implies in terms of what's needed, well then methodology is we have to develop much deeper grounding in urban ethnography. That means urban ethnography is, of course, the study of the people and the cultures and the ethnicities that we're working with. So since we're not coming in as experts with quantitative skills that can answer everything, or with beautiful maps that can answer everything, we need to be able to talk to people about their own desires, their hopes, their fears, what they want in life. And that implies that you have to be able to talk to people and listen to them and not just tell them. So they're suggesting, again, that we need key informants, so we need people that can help us understand whom we're planning with. So they say then we need to collect not just information, but what those people, what those communities really want, so that we can engage in joint problem solving. And then finally, they point out that we need recruitment. We need more diversity in the profession. I think it was mentioned that I was a co-founder of the Planners of Color Interest Group within the Association for Collegiate Schools of Planning. And so we've tried at the national level, also when I was president of ACSP, we tried to help, at least in terms of diversity of faculty. But I think actually the recruitment needs to take place at the grassroots. So we need people who are willing to go into high schools or elementary schools and talk about the potential for planning. And we need to do it in a way that helps people overlook the bad reputation that planning has in some corners because of the legacy of urban renewal, so that we can begin to attract more and different kinds of people into the profession. And then finally, I'll just go to Norman's chapter. So his chapter is the last one in the book. And there was just something he said so beautifully, I can do no better than to just read it. So this is what he and his co-author said. The fourth lesson of equity planning practice involves hope and persistence. Rather than an optimist or a pessimist, the equity planner should be a possibilist, realizing that all things are possible under the right circumstances. What may seem impossible today becomes tomorrow's reality. Consider that in the 1980s, in one decade alone, the Berlin Wall fell, communism collapsed, and apartheid ended. The equity planner must have faith that change in the direction of a more equitable society is possible and that their work may contribute to that change. The planner must not hesitate to suggest plans and policies that are currently impractical or politically infeasible, even though that may be the case. The institutions of society change constantly, but they change very slowly. And the ideas that at first seem impractical become practical when the time is right. And then the last part of this passage is so indicative of Norm's spirit. When good ideas are rejected, the equity planner must pick them up and put them back on the table to advance in new and different ways. If the planner demonstrates professional competence, argues the merit of ideas, and backs up their constructive recommendations with sound data and careful analysis, these suggestions may be adopted. So friends, those are just a few comments. I just wanted to just say, I hope you don't mind. I'm in a personal sharing mood lately. I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to just draw that connection without crying. I think I managed. Please, questions, whatever questions you have.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, and I'm almost to tears as well. So I got into urban planning because of I was in sociology, and I kind of wanted to make a difference. And you hear from people in the field above you that you can't change everything and make everything better. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, do you have a piece of advice for when you kind of meet those barriers, just that keeps you going for your mission of equity, if that does that make sense? Yes. What I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, well, I was also a sociology major.
Yeah, that's my undergrad.
And I will say you will find more opportunities for change in planning than you would in sociology. Yeah. So that's one thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would tell my students, first of all, sometimes you have to find your own opportunities. I know we tell people to go out and look for a job, but sometimes you have to go look for the job you want. And sometimes that means you may have one job that is essentially paying the bills, and another one where your heart really is. It may be volunteer service, for example, or it might be assisting with some special project where maybe you're a consultant or something of that sort. But I think a part of it is just to keep eyes open in terms of what are the potentials, where do I see opportunities for change, and how can I make a contribution to those opportunities. And I don't think those opportunities have to be limited to whoever is paying your salary or however you're paying your bills. That, here I've lived for quite a few decades now, and much of the work I've done as an adult human has not been in the context of a job. It's been someplace else. But if you are fortunate enough to find a place that really does allow you to offer service to humanity in a way that makes your heart sing, then be grateful and do that. But it may take a few months, a few years. You've got your whole life ahead of you, so you heard that before. So just keep looking. And yes, you left sociology, so. I'm sorry, are there sociologists here?
So June, Norm was an insider in part, and I think he conceded that planners rarely, if ever, had control over resources in city halls, had the power in the normal political sense. But he had this idea that planners like himself could influence those in power, including mayors, governors. What do you think about that idea of planners as influence, like horse whisperers, or some clever way of influencing policy beyond their normal ability to do that?
Yeah, I think he describes that very well in his book, Making Equity Planning Work. And in the 1982 article, the retrospective view of the Cleveland Policy Plan Report, which I used to assign. So I assigned students to read that. And one of the reasons I did was, of course, because of the idea of equity planning, but also because of his political methodology. And one of the things that he did that was, when I say political, I don't mean in terms of partisan politics. I mean in terms of survival within the bureaucracy. One of the ways he did that was to be sure that he and the other planners made themselves useful to decision makers. And making themselves useful meant in part offering data, analysis, and clear thinking when maybe they weren't getting it from other places. So I think this idea of making sure that you can, we might think of it as building up credibility, you can build up brownie points with the people that you work with. That gives you a little more leeway to do the bold, courageous things that Krumholz was recommending. So I don't know, Dennis, if that's what you're thinking of. Yeah, so he taught us in terms of method as well as content, definitely.
Thank you very much for coming back. I'm an intergenerational educator, and I wonder if you think of the future of urban planning, whether we need to think about relationships between older folks and younger folks differently and avoid some of the segregation that we've created in our city spaces. So is there a role for thinking creatively, particularly in an era of climate change and with so many older people in our urban environments and rural environments, to think about those relationships differently, plan differently?
Yeah, both about age and about climate change, absolutely. And I think, again, planners have to begin to think about those things and to think of creative solutions for example, the disparity between different income groups or different ethnic groups, different ages, and certainly the effects of environmental degradation, including global warming, climate change. But I think we talked before, didn't we? Did we talk just before? Yeah. And as I remember, you were in the medical field? Yeah. So planners have less power than you might be used to. You know, you're used to doctors, and nobody actually has to listen to us. So I'm sorry, because it's a grand title, planner, urban planner. You know, people have made movies about it. There's one out now, Megalopolis or something, The Grand Planner. But that's not, don't believe it. It's not true. So what Krumholz did, was when I talked about his political methods, we have to use the power of persuasion and the power of offering information that's useful to the decision makers, and the power of visualization. So we can envision what needs to happen, but in this country, we don't have the power to actually make it happen. In some countries, there is more power. Saudi Arabia, for example, even Great Britain, though I'm not sure they've used it well, but they do have more power. But here, we're more of we're the servants to the decision makers of the public sector, and I'm happy to be a servant. But it does limit power. Maybe that's a good thing. So guys, thank you so much. It was lovely to visit. I will leave before the reception's done, but if you'd like to speak personally, if you can grab me before I leave for the airport, happy to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. I'm sure that you will get accosted by many people in the audience today, in a good way. Now I'd like to turn it over to Chris Ronayne, our county executive, to say a few words in Norm's honor and about Norm's style and about their relationship. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Dr. Thomas. I didn't have these when I was a student, but I do now. So, and I realize I am standing between a break and snacks, which I have to tell you to start off about Norman. Those who knew him well, worked with him, or studied under him, he was a snacker. He loved to run around the building, the old building next door, and find whoever had anything that he could scrounge. He was a mouse in the house. So I don't want to stay too long before your break for snacks. But I also have to tell a story, as I think the opening pitch is probably right now with the Guardians and the Tigers, but I at least have it wearing on my sleeve. But I remember a night coming into this building, and I left CSU as a student and become a practitioner. And Norm used to have me back, as he's had a lot of you, to guest lecture in his classes. And it was a 6 o'clock class, and the Guardians were in the playoffs with the New York Yankees. And I walked upstairs and I said to the students naively, well, I'm sure you'll get out early tonight, and I'll probably only be with you for the next hour. Norm said, we'll see you till 9 o'clock, Ronayne. So he was a baseball fan, but we stayed the entire time. So whatever the score, here's to Norm, and you will get some snacks soon. I'm really glad to be back at the Levin College. Every time I come here, I am taken back to Norm Krumholz, and I'm taken back to so many of my professors who are out here today. I'm also taken back to a building that doesn't exist anymore, but some of the professors who taught in it remember it well, the red brick building next door. And so I sort of have my augmented reality glasses on, and I think about life walking through the old two-story brick building. And the first time I ever met Norm, it was with Dr. Roberta Steinbacher, who I walked in literally as a nomadic tweener between undergrad and not knowing what the heck I was going to do with that undergrad degree. And Dr. Steinbacher literally sort of with premonition said, you need to meet Norm. And I didn't know Norm. I had heard about Norm from a guy named Stuart Meck, who said there's a lot of talent up here at Cleveland State, and he was with the APA and was lucky to have him as a professor in undergrad. But I met Norm in the next building thanks to Dr. Steinbacher and Debbie Brown, and I got enrolled for a class just into the first year of 1992. I love the comment about intergenerational studies and planning, because even though I was in my early 20s, Norm was already in his early 60s, but the amount of institutional knowledge that he had on this town was unparalleled. And I got an entire indoctrination about Cleveland through the lens of the former planning director and teacher, Norm Krumholz. So what would Norm do? A few of you have heard me say this before or asked this question, but indulge me as I scripted probably the same notes I did last year over a bowl of chili this afternoon, just some thoughts on Norm, because he keeps ringing in my ear with the same remembrances. But I said the same thing last year, and a question maybe we should all ask. Those who've known Norm well, those who've read about Norm, those who've heard about Norm, and those who don't even know Norm that well, what would Norm do? It's a question that I've had lucky in my brain for 30 years as a framework for action. And if you've read Norm or worked with him, you knew he always asked the question, who pays, who benefits? It's been said over and over. And how does the work we do make a difference for those who have the least choices? That was Norm's mantra, that was his way of living, and it lives on, I think, in all of us who had the pleasure to be in Norm's life. I was lucky to jump into an intro to urban planning class and a neighborhood planning class, and then seeing out a lot of my professors, lucky to be in your classes. I think the thing we all know about Norm is his class was a living learning lab of his knowledge at City Hall and also his knowledge in the neighborhoods. So he would put us out into, I love, at some point slogans changed, but at one point the university's slogan was engaged learning, and that was all about what Norm was about. The city was the university. And I remember going out to St. Clair Superior Coalition and a community development corporate that I didn't know much about, but walking block by block, house by house, and learning about housing and what had happened in the neighborhood and what was still happening in the neighborhood, even in the early 90s, was a legacy of redlining and blockbusting. And Norm taught us to try to understand the city better by meeting the people who were making things happen in neighborhoods, and those who weren't, but those who were struggling to just stay in their neighborhood and stay in their home, and learn from the people. I think that's the first thing about Norm, is it's always about the people. Shakespeare has this line I've cited a few times before, what of a city but its people? And that was Norm. It was his lens, as Dr. Thomas said, it was really about people, and it was less about coded land use plans and statistical analysis. While those are important, I don't want to undermine that, but the most important thing to Norm was how the work we did affected and does affect the people we work for. As you've heard, Norm worked under 3 very different mayors. It's good to see a few friends from City Hall and some other sister agencies today, but there could have been no more different mayors than Carl Stokes, Ralph Perk, and Dennis Kucinich. But he somehow survived those 10 years with 3 mayors and of all different perspectives. I think the thing we all know, is how much they each respected Norm and how much they learned. I remember reading about Carl Stokes' travels with Norm at the American Planning Association meetings, where Carl, I remember reading a speech that he gave in New Orleans, and really just reading Norm. It was all Norm about equity planning, and this was in the late 60s. 50 years ahead of its time. 25 years later, I actually traveled with Norm to an APA conference, and I remember never getting through an aisle at the Orlando conference with Norm because he was such a rock star. Everybody wanted to talk to him, students, practitioners, everybody of all generations. So you couldn't get anywhere at an APA conference with Norm Krumholz. I was lucky to be his graduate assistant in a really, really formative time in my life. He did introduce me to Carl Stokes, and I was just a GA in my 20s, and the late, great Carl Stokes, first African-American mayor of a major American city, was sitting in on a cities and films class. I can't remember which it was about, but it had something to do with politics and the cityscape. We saw a lot of good ones with Norm. Somebody should pull out that syllabus someday, and we should just run it all week long in honor of Norm. But Carl Stokes walked into the aisle after commenting on the film, and I asked him, I just stepped out into the aisle, and I said, Mayor, would you have a cup of coffee with a student? And Carl Stokes said, yeah, I'll see you Saturday at Arabica on Shaker Square. A few of you have heard me say this, but it changed my life. And that was Norm that connected us to a practitioner like Carl Stokes. And what changed my life was the last words that Carl Stokes said as I got up from a coffee after a half hour with coffee with Carl. He said, change comes in inches in this town. Change comes in inches. And then he walked away. And the next time, he left me with that. The next time I saw him was actually at the Rotunda at City Hall at his funeral. And he'd gone off to Seychelles as an ambassador and done other things. But that ringing in my ear of change comes in inches, I took it 2 ways. I took it, one, change isn't happening fast enough, and change today isn't happening fast enough in terms of equity. But I also took it in the way that maybe Carl Stokes applied himself, and that is, you got to meet people where they're at and work with them, and it's a slow navigation sometimes to get to where you want to go, but it'll happen. So it's both motivating and frustrating that change does come in inches. But Norm gave students a chance. Introductions to people like, in my case, Mayor Stokes, or putting us in places we were way over our skis, like the Planning Accreditation Board, which I proudly served on for Norm as a student. I see my old boss, Jim Kostelik, out there, and I remember Norm said to me when I got into my first job, he said, get out of the cube, which, Jim, we had lots of cubes in the old CPC office, and he said, and no disrespect, Howard, a dear friend and good mentor to me, Howard Mayer from Nowaka, he said, and don't spend too much time with the highway guys. Those were two great pieces of advice from Norm. But he had this savvy wisdom about him, and sometimes I think he just had fun with students in the ways in which he advised. Many members of Norm's bologna lunch are out here today. I was eating my chili, kind of wishing I had a little bologna to write this with, but Bob, Bill, Lisa, Ruth, John, Dennis, Raldo, Janice, you might have been there, John Wilbur, who I know we're going to pay further tribute to, but was one of Norm's guys, was one of Norm's people in city planning, and I was lucky to work with him as well as city planning. But we always had fun kind of talking about today's news. It was sort of like the McLaughlin show, for those that can remember that, where you would walk sort of around the table, and either Norm or Raldo would say, wrong, and you'd work to get it right, whatever the policy issue was of the day. But I do have a lot of deference because I was sort of the student in the room, and I think my role, even still as a county exec and having 30 years of tread on the tires since being with Norm in class, but he's never leaves me. I'm forever his student, and I think probably that's a commonality with all of us, is that whether you're just hearing about him today and learning more, or you've known him for decades, we're always students to Norm. But I'm always really, I get a smile when I think about city planning office, and I see a lot of you sitting right here at the center table that worked with Norm in probably what was the most gloried days of city planning. You may not have thought so at the time, but we all look back, and I was a successor planner before Bob Brown, who's also here. We were in city planning offices as directors, but trying to ever be anywhere near Norm's shoes and try to walk in those shoes. Think about those days at City Hall when you guys weren't just writing a landmark document, the Cleveland Policy Planning Report, you were living it. And I always just, in some respects, just think with great admiration what days those could have been. My favorite job, I say this even as your county executive at work for you, but I say this, that my favorite job was always the city planning director of Cleveland, and I got to do it for 4 short years. Bob, a few more years, and Norm for a storied decade with 3 very different mayors. Norm on politics, there was a question earlier about politics. I mean, he would live by the idea that politics and planning are inextricably linked. There's really no distance between politics and planning. The minute we think there is, the minute we probably don't plan as well, because you've got to get inside others' heads, and you got to get inside the heads sometimes of your principal electeds that you're trying to work with, but the citizens too, the citizen politic, it's inextricably linked. Norm was an FDR liberal. Loved that about him always. He was proud about that. He worked on an advisory committee also in the Carter administration. While he had a actual relationship with Bernie Sanders and spent some time with Pierre Clavel and Bernie up at Pierre Clavel's summer cottage up in New York, and talked about that weekend with a lot of fun. He actually supported Hillary Clinton in that run. And he said to me, a day he was getting his honorary doctorate, he said, she's the most ready person for this office that I've ever seen. And I agreed and was lucky to have breakfast with Hillary Clinton about a month later and came back and said, you're right, Norm. And then, the surprise of 2016. And I guess I'd say to you with 27 days left, if I can politic just a little from up here, make your vote matter. Don't take anything for granted. And on a more levity note with Norm in politics, he wanted to teach his students about community. So whether it was going out to a CDC and walking the blocks and understanding what happened to housing, or in the case of one day I show up at Norm's office and he says to me, I need a little help. I said, what's that, Norm? He says, I've got a former student who's running for city council. I wonder if you could go out and see if you could volunteer yourself for his campaign. Who am I to say no to Norm? And I'm sure that person, because it was Norm asking, was a person of quality, conviction, and ethics. So I get to, as many of you know, Bob Hudacek's door, and Bob Hudacek was a wonderful guy who is a wonderful guy, just worked the neighborhoods, but found his way into banking, and he never left his heart out of community development and what community reinvestment's all about. But I get to the door on Norm's offering to join. I think I'm going to a meeting with a bunch of volunteers, and we'll all be there. It's Bob and myself. And he says, am I meeting my new campaign manager? That was Norm, just set me up, right? So we had a lot of fun in that campaign, though. You can learn a lot when you're out knocking on doors. And this ward back when was literally from North Broadway through downtown, east out to St. Clair, and kept going all the way out to 72nd Street. It was amazing immersion. Jay Westbrook, I see you there, former council president, my friend and my councilman. There's nothing like learning about planning and politics than knocking on the doors as you've done all these years. So that for me was formative. It was about experiential learning, engaged learning. Raldo's comment about Norm being in the pebble in the shoe of corporate Cleveland, that was once one of Raldo's columns that featured Norm. I, again, am envious to the staff team because you guys got to be the pebbles in the shoes of corporate Cleveland because Norm was too. And I love that because he just had no fear. And people listened to Norm whether they agreed with him or not. And I've heard that legacy from some of the corporate Clevelanders that whatever we had differences on, we always listened to Norm Krumholz. Norman, actually, the Planning Commission had kind of the last laugh. After Norm, Hunter Morrison was the planning director, and then myself, Bob Brown, Fred Collier, and Joyce Huang today. But Norm got to come back as a CPC board member. And Bob, I couldn't imagine having lived with Norm as the board member, just the dean of it all, advising as your board member. But he had a lot of fun with that. I think you all know Norm lived out near the Shaker Square neighborhood with his wife, Virginia, and their sons and daughter. Late in life, after he lost Virginia, he found a friend that he had reunited since from high school. And she wrote him a postcard and asked about him if he was the Norm that she knew, and he was, and lo and behold, he went out to Annapolis, Maryland, and met Helena some 70 years later. And he lived into his 90s happily dating Helena. So when he talk about that, we go to lunch every year on his birthday and many more in between, but he would always talk about Helena and his life with Virginia and the kids. He just saw joy in living right through to his 90s. The last day I met him, was at a dinner with a few of you just around the corner. And Norm just stepped off the curb with a spring in his step, and that's the last I saw of him. But he's always with us. He used to say he's got the trifecta of jobs. He had it as planning director, and then with neighborhood centers, and then teaching, which he loved. And again, as I'm mentioning, the way in which he taught as a practitioner and encouraging his students to get out of the cube and experience and be mindful of the highway, guys. But I've actually taken that to heart many times because you do have to compartmentalize when you're in a job like I have, and it's you have to shed something an hour later and really focus on the next thing. And Jay, you said this to me once, be present. Norm was always capable of being present and not overthinking the gravity of anything that he was involved in. He taught from the lens of a practitioner, and he did make you think outside the box. I remember my last paper I wrote for Norm. I still trying to find it somewhere in the attic, typed out, not computer, not saved, but it was about multi-county stadia finance. There's one for you. The reason I wish I could find it is because I wish we could sort of ask other counties to participate in stadia finance, but that's another thing. Maybe we'll keep at it. December 2019 was Norm's last month here on Earth, and we celebrated his life here at Cleveland State, March of 2020. He left us right before COVID. It was literally the last day before COVID sort of, everybody went home, everybody went remote, and everybody sheltered with their families. I kind of wonder how Norm would have both worked through COVID and what he would have said about COVID and how he would have reacted. Sometimes I used to think, I'll just admit this to you, I wish Norman Krumholz was president of the United States, and that's how I sort of looked at him in my life. He knew all. But as far as not having to be in the burden of COVID, it was a blessing for him because Norm wasn't the kind of person to want to work remote or talk to you vis-a-vis a computer. When you think about today, the changes that have happened post-COVID, we've really gotten isolated, right? We've really gotten remote from one another. And I wonder how Norm would navigate the times that we're in, sort of the hybrid of times. But I know he would be a beacon of inspiration and just good wisdom to all of us. as we try to socially connect again, because he was really about neighborhoods, social connectivity, basements of churches and rec centers, and he was an ecumenical sort of cross-cultural guy who could be anywhere, could be in any room at any time with anyone. But I think his most prevailing influence on me was to be experiencing life and learning about it as you work and go in your community, out in the community. He lives on at the APA and with the AICP, with the American Institute of Certified Planners exam that some of us have, shuddered when we had to take it, but we got through it. Norm actually got put forth, and I don't think he was promoting himself and his work on this. I think others recognized the body of work that he had and why it was so important that equity became a part of the AICP examination. And that to me is like, it embodies the impact of Norm Krumholz, that it's in all of our teachings now and even in our tests. I think back on the old building a lot. I think of the times when I was so proud to be a student of Norm's, and moreover even the GA for Norm. And I think back about how students ran through the old brick building on an exchange because we formed the student APA the second to last year I was with Norm in school. And all these students ran through, and they were all equipped with making equity planning work, and they literally wanted to talk to Norm about his book from SUNY Buffalo. It made me proud that he was my professor, and he was our professor, and he was our friend, and he was right out of Cleveland. I'll close out so you can get to snacks as Norm would want. As far as the future goes, I mean, I think I state probably the obvious that Norm Krumholz was 50 years ahead of his time, perhaps more. But he was talking and working with the team out there on equity planning 50 years before it really took hold. And for those of you now practitioners out in the working world, I think it took till the second decade of the 2000s to really pick up on equity. And it was stuff that he and his team were working on all the way through, whether it was transit. I mean, he was a Johnson fan, Tom Johnson fan, because of the 3-cent fare, but it was always about fairness in transit. It was about fair share housing when it came to our public housing and market affordable housing. It was about just helping people with more choices. And I think he was 50 years ahead of his time, and the future really is about back to the future. It is about looking back on Norm's body of work and advancing it. It's starting to find its way into important county programs and federal programs. I think about Norm with that question, what would Norm do every day when we think about housing, when we think about justice, when we think about transportation, when we think about the cost of it all. But things like the Federal Justice 40 program as it relates to climate and climate impact, particularly on communities of economic disadvantage. Or locally, Norm was a big fan of some of the community-based foundations and the local CDCs and the settlement houses and partners like Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry. But I think he'd be proud that Tim Tramble, the CEO of the St. Luke's Foundation, uses a participatory pathway to make decisions about grants in community. And so St. Luke's actually asks the citizens how we should use the funds to benefit the citizens. That's all Norm in a way, whether it's directly linked or indirectly linked, as Norm's impact on equity has been enormous. What does the community think? What would Norm do? Thank you. Let's go eat.
So our next part of the program is some reminiscences also about the past, but also lessons for the future. Before we have a panel of people up here to talk about their perspectives on the impact of the policy plan, both back then and today, we have a special speaker, and she is going to talk a bit about being there back in City Hall with Norm and his staff producing that report, and that is Janice Cogger. So if I could have Janice come up. She's going to tell us a bit about what spurred this effort and this highly unusual document for its times, the Policy Plan Report of 1974, released in 1975. Janice?
Thank you, Dennis. So here it is, the original. I'm going to talk a little bit about just the context of the time when this was written, because in some ways it's very much a document of its time. What was going on in Cleveland? Well, in 1966, it was the Huff riots. In 1967, it was the election of Carl Stokes as the first black mayor of a major metropolitan city. In 1968, it was the Glenville riots. It was a time of social unrest and social change. And I think that that's important to know. And Carl Stokes, who became the mayor, I'm going to quote from this wonderful monograph by Raldo. And if you haven't gotten it and you haven't looked at it, you should, because it really talks about how Cleveland has evolved and the politics of Cleveland. Anyway, this was Carl Stokes before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission in Cleveland. We have in Cleveland developed the art of accentuating the positive to exclusion of remedying the negative. How difficult it is, but necessary, to advocate as a remedy the accenting of the negative. How else to strike at and endeavor to dispel the deep, almost indigenous false sense of security and accomplishment that pervades this city? And so, basically, Norm came here under an administration that was very sympathetic to the goals expressed in this document. And he brought with him first Ernie Bonner from the University of Wisconsin, who brought me with him subsequently, and then Doug Wright from the University of Iowa, joined shortly thereafter by Joanne Lazars from the University of Wisconsin, and John Lanier from the University of Iowa. And so we were all straight out of academia in a time when it was civil rights, anti-war, women's rights. And we were all in planning to promote social change. It was also a time when planners had come to realize that their traditional tools were not really very well crafted to meeting the problems of urban communities. These problems were not going to be addressed by zoning, land use controls, things of that nature, because they had to do with poverty and racism. And these were the issues that we all felt from academia that planners should be addressing. We just took it for granted that they should be addressing these kinds of problems. And that was how this came about, in that people came here. I mean, Norm, one of the things I want to put in, Norm was appointed planning director either at the end of Stokes's first term or the beginning of his second term in office. I don't remember exactly which. But it is an indication of how seriously the Stokes administration did not take city planning. That was not high on the agenda of slots to be filled. But when it was filled by Norm, I think he walked into a fairly sympathetic administration. Many, many bright people from all over the country had come here to work as members of Stokes's cabinet. And I have to mention John Little, who was Stokes's chief of staff. And he had worked at either Jones Day or Squire Sanders, I don't know which. And there was kind of rumors that he was put into the administration to kind of put a boundary on what the administration was going to do. And in fact, he was converted. And he was here with Roberta Steinbacher as kind of the first people leading the College of Urban Affairs back when. The document itself includes the policy work done by John Lanier on housing, Doug Wright on transportation, Ernie Bonner on income. And in fact, when the policy papers were being written, I had dumped Cleveland, thinking never to return. And I had gone off. My goal for my first job, in fact, was, and I met it, to save half my gross and then to go off and travel for a year. And that's what I did. And I was welcomed back to Cleveland by Ernie Bonner and John Lanier and Joanne Lazars over an all-night game of hearts in Cambridge, where they were there for the American Association of Planners convention. And we stayed up all night playing hearts. And I thought, yeah, I'll go back. It was the document itself was written shortly after Ernie Bonner and Doug Wright left Cleveland, and Ernie became planning director of Portland, Oregon. And Doug went there to be his transportation person and was responsible for the beginning of the light rail transit system in Portland, and later became an assistant secretary of transportation under Neil Goldschmidt, who was the mayor of Portland when they first went there. The document itself was put together without great ideas that this was going to change the planning profession, believe me. It was put together out of a need to produce a plan for Norm and to use what we had developed in terms of policy as part of that, with a very deep commitment on the part of the people who were part of the Planning Commission that this is what they wanted to do, was social change, and we would at least advocate for it. When I first talked to Beth, she didn't know really, but the Cleveland Policy Planning Report was in fact adopted by the Planning Commission. Not by the administration, not by City Council, but by the Planning Commission itself as a result of the work that Norm had done with the Commission, laying the groundwork for this for 3 or 4 years. And remember, this was really at the beginning of Norm's tenure in Cleveland. It was not, he was just really beginning to find what his place was in Cleveland. And he soon found that some of what his place was in areas where there were not specific city departments to cover those areas. So he was very much involved in transit negotiations, the transfer of the Cleveland transit system to the Regional Transit Authority, in which providing information. This was Ralph Perk, mind you. Now we're moving into the Perk administration, where a 25-cent fare was initiated. Probably the most significant thing that was done in those negotiations was that a cap was put on and did not allow for development of heavy rail for the next 5 years. Because at that time there'd been the 5-county transit plan, which proposed to build underground rail all out to the suburbs, and of course would have just facilitated urban sprawl. But that wasn't what people were thinking about. People were thinking about Marta and Bart, and that the way you make your career in public transit is to be a leader in developing your own transit system, which would be 90-10 federal money. Also during the Perk administration, there was the development of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer Authority. I don't think Norm was very much involved in that, because that was the technical guys from the water department and the sewer department. Another thing that happened during that administration was the passage of tax abatement, which I'd like to talk about just a little bit this afternoon. When tax abatement was first talked about as a state law, and it was going to be actually limited to areas with findings of slum and blight, and it enabled the use of both eminent domain in those areas for development and tax abatement. And Norm, I remember going with him to meet with the attorneys who were drafting the legislation. And they were saying, well, you know, just because it exists as something the city can do, it doesn't mean they have to do it. And Norm said, get real. The minute this is passed and the first development project comes in, and it gets tax abatement, the game's over. Everyone's going to want it for whatever they do. And it was prophetic. It was true. And that's what's happened. And basically, now, in the last, 50 years, 40 years, the city has given away any expansion of its property tax base for 15 years at a time. That has cost the Cleveland Metropolitan School District over $200 million in revenues between 2007 and 2023. And I'm particularly, this gets me riled because I left urban planning at the age of 50 and I went and got a degree in elementary education, the bottom of the food chain. I wanted to get away from all the egos involved, and I just wanted to be somewhere where I could go in every day and I could do my thing with the kids. Of course, that meant that I had to buy all the school supplies for all the kids because there wasn't enough money in the school's budget to buy school supplies. And you really couldn't send a long list home with kids who were worried about where they were going to get dinner of things that their parents should buy to bring in to school. The situation in Cleveland now, and I'm going to make this really short, is that once again, developers, every planner is an advocate. They talk about advocacy planning, but planning is by its nature an exercise in advocacy. And it just depends upon what you choose to advocate and what risks you're willing to take to advocate for certain things. And at this point, even without an application, every project in the city of Cleveland, all the multifamily housing that's going up, is all tax abated for 15 years. And now we're putting TIFs on top of that 15 years. Now, the TIFs are not going to affect the school's revenues, but they will affect the library's revenues, the county's revenues, the human resources revenues, all of the other things that are based on the property tax are being affected by these decisions hugely. And in fact, I took a tour one Sunday a while ago, the funny bus. It wasn't funny at all, so don't go on it, skip it. It was really pretty pathetic. The woman just kept making jokes of this 92-year-old man who was celebrating his birthday. How many girlfriends do you have? It was awful. But I got to see little parts of downtown that I hadn't seen before. And I was gobsmacked by the amount of new development going on down in the flats on the embankment from the west side. And I look at that and I say, and none of that's going to pay property taxes for 15 years. But they're going to need services. This is I'm up here because Norm wouldn't let an opportunity like this go by without having something controversial to say. And that's what Norm did. And Norm just spoke the truth. And there are a lot of people who didn't like the truth he spoke, but he spoke the truth. And I want to say, Bob Brown, if you want to read something that's wonderful, it's short, on the Cleveland Policy Planning Report. Bob Brown in 2015 wrote a piece, and I don't know, Bob, where it was published, but you have copies of it. And it's really short, and it's really to the point. And he writes it from the perspective of another city planning director. And he says, I couldn't always implement what Norm talked about, but I always had it in the back of my mind. It's kind of it's there. Norm instilled it in people, that there should be an emphasis on equity. And instead, we're building not just market rate housing, luxury housing with tax abatement, And we're building it all for, I don't know who or whom, are going to occupy all of these units that are going up, all of a sudden. But I do know what caused it, and that is Trump's tax plan, which makes it possible. Multifamily housing has always been about the unique tax benefits of multifamily housing on your income taxes. And now they've made it so that you can avoid, Trump made it so you could avoid ever paying capital gains tax as long as you just keep rolling it over into new developments. And so what's going on in Cleveland now, this is not being financed by local lenders. This is not being financed by people who really know the Cleveland housing market. This is being financed by insurance companies, pension funds, all kinds of institutional investors who know nothing about the housing market in Cleveland. And I find it frightening, I will be honest with you. And I'm sure Norm would find it frightening, that this is kind of the point. So it's a challenge. And I must say that Norm made constant decisions that endangered his career. But he was not a careerist. I mean, he enjoyed the acclaim and the accolades he got for the policy planning report and his work in equity planning in Cleveland. But that never stopped him from telling the truth and presenting information to decision makers that would be the basis for making these decisions. And some of the decisions that are being made now could have very serious consequences for this community in the future. And that's just the way it is. And I see no one out speaking publicly about these decisions. I don't see it. I don't see it happening. In fact, my councilman, who is the council president, in fact, said in regard to a development that we were opposing in our neighborhood that he couldn't do really much about it because it might be considered anti-development. So, heaven forbid we should ask any questions about who benefits and who pays from these developments. And so a neighbor of mine I was going to quote, he calls it, he just writes because he likes to write. But some of the stuff he writes is just great. And he calls it that Cleveland suffers from toxic positivity and unrelenting civic optimism. And it's always a new, and I liked this, I think it was Bob and yours, somebody wrote this, I read it just today. There's always a new flashy toy, and a bridge across to the lakefront. Something that it's all going to turn around. Cleveland will be different. Cleveland is the second poorest city in the large city in the United States, and it's number one in child poverty. And those issues, I'm sorry, and I don't see much of any public discussion about those issues right now, and how channeling all of these funds into new luxury housing developments is really going to affect the poverty level of people in this community and the needs of our children. So that's all I have to say in Norm's honor. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So June mentioned Googling Norm's citations. I decided in the context of the topic to Google Cleveland 1974. I did not come up with the policy plan. Instead, I came up with the 10-cent beer night at the old stadium and the riot. For those of you who are not here, and that included me, they had to halt the game, whatever's happening with the Guardians now, because of the drunken fans chugging 10-cent beer at the stadium. A memorable Cleveland event, I guess. Okay, we're going to have a panel discussion about the old times and today. And we have a couple of panelists. Unfortunately, Bob Jaquay was unable to join us due to illness today. Kathy Hexter, along with our college, and also a co-author editor with Norm on that book, their last, Equity Planning Now, is going to be our moderator, and she is going to interrogate the panelists and hopefully give you some more perspective on the policy plan and Norm Krumholz and his staff's contribution to the planning profession.
So I was just saying, I'm not sure what more we can add that hasn't already been said, but we're going to try. So I think it's fair to say that we've all heard from all of our great speakers that over Norm's long career, he left an indelible mark on Cleveland, on the planning profession, on planning education, and hopefully on future planners. I think it's not possible to overstate the significance of Carl Stokes' election as the first African-American mayor of a major American city in 1967. And his commitment to social justice was unique. And the fact that he brought Norm to Cleveland to help him work on that, I think deserves another, we have to recognize the importance of that. We also have heard a lot already about the Cleveland Policy Planning Report and how it was such a major shift in not just Cleveland's planning strategy, but how it filtered out to the entire country over time. So Janice gave us a good background of what was going on in Cleveland at the time, but our panel is going to shed more light on that right now and also share their personal stories of interacting with Mark. So with Norm, Norm. I'm going to introduce them really quickly, and then you'll learn more about them as we have our discussion here. So we're really pleased that John Grabowski is able to join us today. John is the editor of the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, and he's really going to be the one who's going to help set the context. He is also an associate professor of applied history at Case, Western Reserve University, and is the senior vice president for research and publications at the Western Reserve Historical Society. So he knows more about Cleveland's history than probably any of us. You've already heard a little bit from Dennis Keating, who is an emeritus professor here at the college, who worked very closely with Norm over his career, and who also had a great influence on planning education. And our third panelist in the middle here is Howard Mayer, who is celebrating his 80th birthday today. So happy birthday, Howard. Howard most recently was executive director of NOACA, the Regional Transportation and Environmental Planning Organization. Stay away from those transportation planners, is that what Chris said? But he's also worked he has a long career going back to many local planning organizations, which he's gonna talk about. So, and I'm sorry that Bob Jaquay is not able to join us. He's recovering from COVID and very nicely chose not to expose all of us. So, okay. So my first question for each of you, how did you know Norm? or how did you know of Norm?
I really knew Norm through his wife, Virginia Krumholz. And I was an archivist for many years, and Virginia was an archivist, and we were part of an archival group. So that was the introduction, but the real introduction was I usually work with former Mayor Mike White on his neighborhood leadership development program. And in the early years of that program, it would be Grabowski and Norm Krumholz. And we would work together, and Norm had wonderful stories about Saul Alinsky, about radical planning, if you will. And he also taught me something I think that's really part of the going on in the conversation there. He told me that that neighborhood on the west side that we called Tremont is no longer Tremont, it is known as Tremont, which gets into the topic of gentrification, which we've touched upon here today, and I think I may give some historical perspective on that later.
Well, Kathy said most recently I was at NOACA. Well, it was 12 years ago, so it wasn't just yesterday. So I've been gone from NOACA for quite a while now. So I first met Norm in, well, let me back up a bit. So in 1970, I got my first professional job. This is after many years of schooling, summer internships, part-time jobs, and the like. I was hired as an environmental health planner for an organization called the Metropolitan Health Planning Corporation, long gone. The environmental division consisted of my boss and me. I was hired for the magnificent salary of $11,000 a year, which seemed like a lot of money in those days. So while I was there, while we were there, got a call from Norm Krumholz. So by early 1970s, Norm was already well-known and a rising star in the planning field. He had the idea that there should be a new town in Warrensville Township. Now, many of you probably never heard of Warrensville Township, but it's now lost to history, and its lands ended up as parts of Highland Hills, Beechwood, Orange, what else? Warrensville Heights. So there were 850 largely vacant acres, and Norm had the idea that that would be an ideal location for a new town. And at that time, new towns were sort of the rage in the planning world. There was Reston, Virginia, which had become quite famous, Columbia, Maryland. They were the poster children for the new town movement in the United States. So Norm had the idea that a Cleveland-managed new town in the Cleveland suburbs would be a great idea. And my boss and I loved the idea, and we were thrilled to have the opportunity to work on that project, but it came to nowhere. Couldn't get the support of anybody, and the idea just faded out. The end result for me personally was that I acquired the acquaintanceship and later the friendship of Norm Krumholz. So that's how I first got to meet him. By the way, just because you were a friend of Norm Krumholz didn't mean you were exempt from being criticized by Norm Krumholz. He had a very critical eye for a lot of things, and he was always finding a way to needle me and probably everybody else. So should I keep going, or is that enough for now? Okay. So I met Norm vicariously from afar while I was a student and then a professor in the San Francisco Bay Area, having gotten my PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, in 1978, in a building that was named after Catherine Bauer Worcester and her husband, she being one of my heroines from her work in the Great Depression for affordable housing. And sort of heard of Norm's name in terms of planning, didn't really know a lot about him, but I was attracted enough to end up applying for a job here and ending up here. And you have to understand the context. For example, while at Berkeley, amidst many protests, there was a memorable night in which thousands of people surrounded City Hall while the City Council was asked to sign a peace treaty with the Republic of North Vietnam. And the city attorney had to explain to the crowd or mob, as you will, cities don't sign treaties with foreign countries. And then the night went on, and then at about 4 o'clock in the morning, the city council finally decided, yes, the city of Berkeley could sign a peace treaty with the Republic of North Vietnam, and we could all go home for the day. Coming to Cleveland and meeting Norm, as was previously mentioned, I then discovered Norm was a tried and true Roosevelt New Deal Democrat. He was not quite the radical in that sense, coming from the Berkeley Bay Area context. But I came to admire Norm for his steadfastness, and I learned from his writings in the history, one, the tax abatement issue that Janice was talking about. I think he got 1 vote out of 33, as I recall, when Norm opposed the tax abatement granted by the city of Cleveland. I think when he proposed that every city in Cuyahoga County needed to have affordable housing, not just concentrating it in the city of Cleveland. And as I recall from his book chapter on the subject, it got not any votes. It wasn't even discussed. It never came up for any votes. It just died. But Norm carried on. So I had to admire his steadfastness in the face of adversity and never giving up.
Now I want to turn to John, and hopefully you can add even more context to what was going on at the time
When,
in the late 60s and early 70s in Cleveland,
yeah, I can.
and
It's
in other cities too.
Sure. We're looking at, I'll go back way far here. If that's, urban planning in Cleveland really goes back to the turn of the 20th century. Oh God, here goes the historian, just 5 hours. But 2 of the greatest projects in Cleveland, the mall and the Cleveland Terminal Tower Complex, were basically done without any involvement of the people who lived there. So when the terminal was built, there were about 1,000 buildings torn down. There was no structure for where those people would go. And when the mall was built, one of the prides of Cleveland, that was also a large area of ramshackle housing that was just cleaned out with nothing there. So if we look at some of these monuments, you have to figure who paid for them at that point. We'll ratchet it up into the 1930s when Ernie Bowen is bringing in public housing into Cleveland at that time, working with the Roosevelt administration. And then we go to 1942, and we'll eventually get to today. In 1942, Frank Lausche is the mayor of Cleveland, and they put together a plan for Cleveland. And that plan for Cleveland talks about areas that need to be rehabilitated. They talk about a series of roads, a ring road around Cleveland, and spoke roads that will go out to the suburbs. That plan floats around during World War II. In 1949, it is finally approved by a civic vote, and that essentially begins the structure. And the one thing that we have to understand about this city is the fact that the automobile, like in other cities, I think really is one of the villains in the story. And so the interstate highway system, which allows people access to the suburbs, that plays on racial fears. You have moves out. The other thing that happens in the 1940s is the war makes us wealthy. Businesses are booming, and businesses no longer can really function. Factories can no longer function in the city of Cleveland, so they begin looking outside the suburbs. And so Thompson Products builds its new Tapco plant in Euclid. And even after the war, that continues when Chrysler, Ford, and GM build their plants outside of Cleveland. That all begins to drain people out of the city. And the other thing that focuses on that is the increasing African American population, which is rather small at the turn of the 20th century, but the first great migration leaves Cleveland with 70,000 African Americans at the beginning of the Depression. And with the Second World War and the Second Great Migration, you get a larger and larger African American community. Mix that with blockbusting, mix that with money, mix that with the power to drive away, and you begin to see things shift. And so that really takes us up to what is happening in development in the years just before Norm is here. There's Erie View. I spent part of last night watching a film called Cleveland City on Schedule. 1962, you can find it on YouTube, and it's narrated by Chet Huntley, and it's all about urban renewal in Cleveland, and it's all about the future of Cleveland, and it ends with a wonderful shot of that greatest, newest project, Erie View. So that film really is a starter. So what we're looking at is really a very top-down approach to housing, to planning, without any equity at all, without any real involvement of communities of any sort. So that's what sets up what we've been talking about today in sort of the days before. And that's why Norm Krumholz is so important, because he comes in with Carl Stokes, who is a game changer. He's a game changer for the image of Cleveland. He's a game changer in terms of policy. One of the things that we have a dissertation on in Case Western Reserve is Carl Stokes and the environment. And he was very focused on the environment in the urban cities because of what young children were exposed to. And the interesting fact is that the 1969 fire on the Cuyahoga River wasn't much of a fire, but Carl really publicized it because he felt that if we got that publicized, we'd begin to get some traction on environment. So it's more than just equity, it's environment. He's looking at all the things that are going on in the 60s and 70s, and he's bringing them to the city.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add anything to that, or?
Well, I was not here at the time, but one of the things that caught my attention from afar was the Kucinich fight over the Cleveland public power system, with its long history going back to the days of Mayor Tom Johnson and his fight to keep public transit regulated and affordable to a large part of the population of the city of Cleveland around the turn of the century. In fact, I wrote a bit of a history about that long fight with Cleveland Public Power versus CEI. So it seemed like that was an interesting aspect of what was happening in Cleveland, that the city would actually, despite all the problems with public power, fight to the point of the mayor possibly being recalled over his opposition to selling off the city's public power. It seemed to me that sort of fit the context of part of what was in the policy plan, that you had to pay attention to the needs of the people who had few choices, including public transit, public power.
Yeah. I was going to say the other thing about is that sort of the zeitgeist before Norm comes in here, and at the time when Norm comes into Cleveland is one of loss. In 1950, Cleveland is the 7th largest city in the United States, population of 914,000. By 1980, it has dropped to number 18, and the population is just about over 500,000. In that first decade that Norm was working, in the 1970s, Cleveland loses about 20% of its population. So we're looking at the rapid shrinkage of the city, the loss of a tax base even before abatement comes in. And this is what Norm is trying to work with, is all this, what I would call chaos going on in terms of the society that he's trying to serve.
So we had urban renewal, we had the race riots, which destroyed much of Cleveland's neighborhoods. And then we had really a coalition of black and white residents who came together to get Stokes elected as a change agent, really. And you know, all the while, I think planning, as Dr. Thomas was describing, was engineering and regression analysis. But it's still regression analysis. I hope you're all taking that. But how the, you know, and engineering and urban renewal were closely tied together in displacing those people who had the least voice, right, the powerless. And that's who Norm came in, dedicated to working on their behalf. So turning back to the plan, you know, it's important for us to understand that it really was not a plan, as many people have already said, in the traditional sense of the word. It was a policy paper. It was a catalog of objectives, policies, and action programs, and it was not comprehensive. You know, in planning, we talk about comprehensive plan, and that involves zoning and land use and all kinds of things. Comprehensive. This was not. This focused on what the group thought that they could reasonably accomplish given the limited resources that they had. So, as we've heard before, it focused on personal and municipal poverty, deteriorated housing, inadequate public transportation, and declining neighborhoods. And, you know, progress may be measured in inches, but we still have all those problems today. But the goal, famously, was to provide a wider range of choices for those who have few, if any, choices. It was to shift power, to intentionally shift the power from the people who had it to the people who did not. And that was what Norm saw as the job of planners. So the other really unique thing about the plan was that it quoted, you know, Plato, as Donna said, Plato, Jefferson, FDR, and Teddy Roosevelt, Tom Johnson, Daniel Webster, Woodrow Wilson. It was a philosophy and a policy plan. So how radical was this? I guess maybe Howard, this is a good question for you because you were working as a planner in Cleveland at the time. How radical did people see this as? And, you know, what do you think the impact was?
Okay, thanks. Well, by 1975, when the plan was officially published, I was the assistant planning director in Cleveland Heights. I knew many of the people that Janice was referring to who worked on the plan, so I was quite familiar with it. My take on it was that, well, you know, it's a groundbreaking approach to planning. It was simply unknown. I mean, I loved it. And, you know, I have some notes on it. I wrote, what caught my attention, you know, the basic concepts of it, its focus on policy, which caught my attention, the advocacy aspect of it, the fact that it was data-driven. I thought that was extremely important to develop the policies. But the one thing that hasn't been mentioned today is I think that plan had a lot of basic decency to it. It was one of the things that really caught my attention and stayed with me all of these years.
Yeah, I think it's kind of different from some of the very early 1950s urban renewal, 1960s. If you're looking at Longwood Estates and then Garden Valley, both of those were planned without really recognizing the means that the people would have. Both of those were not public housing, they were rentable housing, and both of those had almost immediate problems. But those plans, when they were launched, got Cleveland a lot of ink across the country. This is one of the most important urban redevelopments going on. And the issue, though, was that within 2 years, they were beginning to collapse because of affordability, location. And the other thing that Norm was very interested in, too, is transportation. Because Garden Valley, yes, it's out in Kinsman, but that's, you know, an issue of, you know, bus transport. How frequent is it? How can it be? Can you get back and forth? So there's always the person that's lost in this early planning before Norm comes up with the equity issue.
I'd like to add to that. So one of the issues in the policy plan was public transit, and the reference to the Cleveland transit system I thought was pretty interesting. Cleveland transit system was actually created in the heyday of public transit, and there was a rule that it had followed, which would be funded only through the fare box, which by the 1970s was just totally inadequate.
So the idea of creating a regional transit authority was very much in the works, and Norm was very much involved in the process. And there's a lot of advocacy involved, as Janice mentioned, the 25-cent fare, a whole host of other elements to it. He wanted to make sure that Cleveland residents were properly represented. Also, one of the data items, 1/3 of the population did not own a car. That's a huge percentage of the population could not afford a car. So they were reliant on the CTS, which had, at that time, diminished service, very antiquated pollution-causing fleet. Land use patterns had changed. There's certainly not enough money to invest in getting new vehicles. The CTS was really in very bad shape. Plus, there were another 12 or so other transit systems within Cuyahoga County alone. So the RTA brought all that together. It was quite a masterful bit of diplomacy to make that all happen. And Norm was very, very much involved in that. You mentioned the highways. I want to touch on that a little bit. The big transportation issue of the day was the Interstate 290, the Clark Freeway. Well, you don't know of Interstate 290 and you don't know of the Clark Freeway because they didn't happen. And Norm was very much involved in that process. A lot of other people were too. A lot of people were involved. Norm he had pointed out, he argued that that highway would not benefit Cleveland residents as a transportation mode. 1,400 homes would be lost, not to mention the fact that Cleveland would be responsible for part of the local match, and it didn't have the money. So he was among those who worked hard to get that project defeated. One of the county engineer at that time, a guy named Albert Porter, was very much in favor of that particular highway proposal. The highway would have gone through the Shaker Lakes. So his famous line, allegedly, was, well, Shaker Lakes is just a 2-bit duck pond, who cares?
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is that the outcry in Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights had a lot of money and oomph behind it. And that helped push it. Eventually, Governor Rhodes canceled the project. But the other player that is not usually mentioned in the discussion of it was Carl Stokes. And Carl Stokes worked to get that canceled. And so a great article by Virginia Dawson that really gives Stokes the credit for canceling that freeway. By the way, that freeway is now here, but it's not a freeway. It's called the Opportunity Corridor. And so that raises another issue of what opportunity is on the Opportunity Corridor.
Well, as I understand, some active women in Shaker Heights also had a lot to do with fighting that freeway. I was going to talk briefly about what the policy plan was not, which, as Kathy mentioned, it really wasn't a plan. Comprehensive plans typically looked into the future, 10, 20 years. The 1950 plan, if I'm not mistaken, for Cleveland, a long-range plan assumed that Cleveland was going to grow to 2 million people from almost 1 million. So it envisioned highways, growth, population, not the flight to the suburbs, not the decline of industry and so on. And I think you have to remember it was an action policy. If you read it, we need to do this, we need to do that. It wasn't we should plan for the future and gradually things would change for the better somehow. And in 1974, that was 1 year after, in terms of housing, that Richard Nixon's housing department shut down all federal housing programs in a moratorium. So the idea a year later of Norm and his staff saying, we need to have subsidies for tenants, we need to have, and we had just ended a 10-year goal of basically ending the housing shortage in the United States. That was canceled. We never achieved the goal, of course, but so pretty bold to write in a policy plan that the federal government needed to do all the things that, in effect, it was not doing and had, at least at that point, no real intention of doing from a city planning staff in one city, Cleveland.
Anyway, thank you all for sharing your perspectives. I think in closing, as we look to the future, I want to go again back to something Dr. Thomas said earlier. And, I think the profession of planning has evolved for sure over the 40 years that I've been working in the planning field. And certainly Norm's equity plan was a turning point. And now I think it's really important that we talk not planning necessarily for people who are the most disadvantaged, but how do we plan with? How do we raise those voices? How do we enable those people? How do we enable people to take their own agency and plan their own neighborhoods? Something.
I just add one historical note before we finish, and that is June had mentioned Paul Davidoff, one of my heroes who had fought to do what Norm had proposed here, that is break down the barriers to mixed income, lower affordable income housing in our suburbs. But there were other movements about the same time, so I just want to mention them so we don't forget them. Planners for Equal Opportunity, formed in 1964 in the midst of the civil rights movement, attempted to do what June was talking about, which was to bring more people of a different background and race into planning and deal with racial and poverty issues. In 1972, a housewife in Chicago, Gail Sincata, led the way to try to reverse disinvestment in neighborhoods, just as people were doing here in Cleveland with the Catholic Commission, working with neighborhood groups, and formed National People's Action. Another hero of mine, Chester Hartman, a former colleague who died a few years ago, formed the Planners Network to organize progressive planners around the country, and that started publishing a newsletter in 1976. And Suburban Action, formed by Paul Davidoff, was 1968. So Norm's efforts were not unique. They were unique in a way in the planning field in terms of a plan, which was not a plan. But there were these other movements percolating around issues of race, poverty, housing, all in the midst of other movements like the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to?
I got one
Okay.
last, I got a lot of stuff on Norm. I could talk for the next hour, but little anecdote. So as Norm was approaching his 90th birthday, he was pretty much hobbled by arthritis, and he needed a lift. So he asked if I could give him a ride. I was only too happy to oblige. So he struggled to get in the car, and he looked at me and he said, "My infrastructure isn't so good anymore." I love that line. A sense of humor and a sense of irreverence to go along with all of the towering intellect and advocacy of his career.
And on that note, unless you have something to add, John, I think we'll.
No, it's just been a pleasure to do this and to listen about planning and everything you know about planning, and then to try to put it into a broader historical perspective. And it's an amazing story.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
To that end, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for sharing your thoughts, your memories, and some really important context for us to understand the plan in Cleveland at that time. Thank you. One of the things that I mentioned earlier is that the importance of this event is also connected to student scholarships. And the Norman and Virginia Krumholz Scholarship is an important element, and we're hoping that you would consider donating to the scholarship. There are QR codes on the table. No amount is too small. And to kind of hit home the point of the Krumholz Scholarship, we're going to hear some words by Bob Brown. But before Bob comes up and talks about his time co-teaching with Norm, I'd like to invite Gillian Prater-Lee, one of this year's scholarship recipients, to talk a little bit about what the scholarship means to her. Gillian, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in just this amazing event. It's been so wonderful to learn and hear from all of you and hear about your stories and memories with Norm and the impact he had on the field. I moved back to Cleveland 2 years ago after finishing a master's in urban geography at Penn State. It was very kind of, it was a urban geography program in kind of the middle of nowhere. And it was very theoretical, right? It was really theoretical research. I started working as a community organizer when I moved back here, and I realized that I wanted to develop my technical skills and build my career in that way. So last year, I enrolled in the Master's in Planning program here at CSU. And this March, I started working for the City of Cleveland in the Community Development Department. So it's just been really wonderful to have had and continue to have the experience here at Cleveland State to further my professional opportunities. Right now, I'm actually taking the semester off from grad school. I have a fellowship with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. So I'm doing that right now, but I'm looking forward to coming back to Cleveland State in the spring and using my scholarship. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak and to this academic community. Thank you.